Rome was no longer the Rome of marble triumph alone. It was a city stretched thin across ambition, corruption, and fear. The Senate still spoke in the language of gods and destiny, but behind its marble columns stood soldiers who answered not to ideals, but to coin and command. And then they arrived. No one truly knew how the Spartans crossed time and empire. Some said they were cursed remnants of Thermopylae, others that they were summoned by forgotten rituals buried beneath Roman temples older than the Republic itself. What mattered was not how they came, but what they brought with them: war. They called themselves the Lycurgan remnants, though the Romans simply called them the wolves of the East. There were only 300 of them at first sighting. No horses, no wagons, no supply trains, just armored men with scarred shields, red cloaks darkened by dust and time, and eyes that had never learned fear. They appeared outside the Roman frontier city of Capua during a night when the moon looked cracked, as if even the heavens were uneasy. The city fell within hours, not because it was weak, but because the Spartans did not fight like Romans. Romans fought for territory, glory, survival. Spartans fought like the world had already ended and they had simply been denied permission to die. They did not negotiate, they did not threaten, they erased resistance. When the gates of Capua broke, there were no celebrations, no looting, no chants, only silence. And then, discipline. The Spartans reorganized the city in a single night. Bodies were removed, streets were cleaned, barracks were converted into command halls, and at the center of it all stood their leader, known only as Damaros, a man whose face looked carved rather than born. Damaros did not declare war on Rome immediately. Instead, he studied it. Rome was not a single enemy, it was a living organism. Senators, generals, merchants, slaves, priests, assassins, all feeding into the same pulse of survival and betrayal. And Damaros understood something the Romans had forgotten. Empires do not fall when they are attacked. They fall when they stop believing in themselves. Within weeks, whispers spread through the countryside. A city without corruption, a militia that never slept, soldiers who obeyed without question, but only one law: strength without compromise. Rome responded, of course, it always did. A legion was dispatched from the capital, 5,000 men, disciplined, armored, confident. They expected bandits or rebels. They did not expect philosophy made into steel. The battle took place near the river Anio. The Romans formed their standard lines, shields locked, spears ready. The centurions shouted commands. The earth itself seemed to steady beneath their formation. Then the Spartans came. Not in formation, not in waves, but in silence. They walked directly into the Roman line as if walking through memory rather than resistance. The first clash lasted only minutes, and when it ended, the river ran red not with chaos, but with precision. The Romans had never seen warfare like this. Every Spartan movement was economical, brutal, inevitable. No wasted motion, no hesitation, no fear of death, because death was already accepted before the fight began. The Roman legion broke, not because it was weaker, but because it could not understand what it was fighting. News of the defeat reached Rome before the surviving soldiers did, and in the Senate, panic finally began to wear the mask of reason. "They are barbarians," one senator insisted. "No," another whispered. "Barbarians want wealth. These do not." "What do they want then?" No one answered. Because the truth was beginning to take shape in the silence between their words. The Spartans were not conquering Rome for land, they were attempting to replace it. And somewhere beyond the city walls, Damaros looked toward the horizon of marble towers and said quietly to his commanders, "Rome will not fall in a day, it will fall in steps." And the first step is already taken. Rome did not panic in the way cities usually did. It did something far more dangerous. It organized its fear. The Senate declared the Spartans not an army, but a contagion, a foreign philosophy of violence that threatened the natural order of the world. Messengers were sent across the empire, legions were recalled, borders tightened. But the real war was no longer happening on fields of blood, it was moving into minds. Damaros understood this before Rome fully did. Conquest by the sword was simple, conquest by perception was harder, but more permanent. So the Spartans changed strategy. They stopped advancing. Instead, they let Rome come to them. Capua became a symbol, a warning and an invitation at once. Traders who entered were allowed to leave, soldiers who surrendered were not executed, even spies were returned, alive, unmarked and silent. That silence terrified Rome more than any massacre could have, because silence meant control. Inside the Senate, arguments grew sharper. "Why are they not slaughtering prisoners?" one senator demanded. "Because they are trying to appear righteous," another replied. "No," said a third, voice low. "Because they don't need to." And that was the beginning of Rome's real fracture, not in its armies, but in its confidence. Meanwhile, Damaros did something unexpected. He began recruiting, not prisoners, but defectors. Roman auxiliaries stationed near the frontier started disappearing, not in battles, not in ambushes, but in small, quiet moments where loyalty met exhaustion. A guard on night duty hears a voice offering food instead of orders. A centurion is shown the corruption of his own commander's ledger. A slave is given armor and told he is already strong enough to stand equal. Rome called it treason, but it was worse than treason. It was replacement. The Spartans were not just fighting Rome, they were rewriting what Rome meant to its own people. Then came the event that shifted everything. The collapse of the inner road. A major Roman supply route connecting 3 legions simply vanished. Not destroyed, not blocked, abandoned. Entire garrisons had turned their weapons inward and walked away. When interrogated later, the survivors gave the same answer. They spoke to us like we had already lost. Rome began to respond with brutality. Executions increased, surveillance expanded, entire villages were punished for suspected sympathy. But fear is a strange weapon. It works quickly, but it does not last. And every act of Roman cruelty pushed more people toward the idea that perhaps Rome itself was the true instability. In Capua, Damaros watched reports arrive daily. He did not celebrate victories, he did not boast. Instead, he studied patterns. Rome was not breaking evenly. It was cracking in clusters, soldiers, then merchants, then governors in distant provinces who suddenly stopped sending tribute. One of his commanders asked, "Why not strike the capital now? They are divided." Damaros shook his head. "Rome is strongest when wounded," he said. "It remembers how to become a beast when threatened. We must make it forget how to stand at all." So he ordered something unexpected again. He sent envoys, not diplomats in robes, but Spartan warriors carrying no weapons, only sealed tablets. They entered Roman cities and spoke only one message: "We do not wish to destroy Rome. We wish to end what Rome has become." This confused the Senate more than any battlefield loss, because enemies were supposed to want land, gold, revenge, not transformation. Inside Rome, a dangerous idea began to spread. What if the Spartans were not outsiders? What if they were what Rome itself would become if it stopped lying to itself? This idea infected even the Senate. Debates turned into accusations. Accusations turned into duels. Duels turned into assassinations masked as politics. Rome was now fighting itself, and the Spartans were no longer outside the walls. They were inside the conversation. At night, senators began receiving identical messages carved into wax tablets. "You cannot defeat what you are becoming." One senator burned the message, another kept it, a third tried to resign the next morning and was found dead before dawn. Rumors spread that Spartan agents had entered the capital, but no one could prove it because nothing looked like invasion, it looked like collapse from within. And somewhere far away, Damaros finally allowed himself a moment of stillness. Not joy, not relief, just recognition. Rome was no longer resisting them as an empire, it was questioning itself as an idea. And ideas, he knew, were the hardest things to kill. Rome had faced invasions before. It had burned, rebuilt, expanded, and absorbed enemies like water soaking into stone. But it had never faced something it could not clearly define. The Senate called an emergency session at dawn, though no one had slept. The Curia was filled with voices that overlapped, contradicted, and slowly unraveled into suspicion. "They are infiltrators," one senator insisted. "They are philosophers with swords," another replied bitterly. "They are ghosts," whispered the third, "because no one sees them until something is already gone." Outside, Rome looked normal. Markets opened, children ran through streets, soldiers marched in formation. But beneath that surface, something had shifted. Trust had begun to decay. The Senate's response was decisive, as Rome's responses always were when it felt uncertain. It would create an enemy it could understand. They called it Operation Vermilion Mirror. The idea was simple. If Spartans were infiltrating Rome by blending into its fractures, then Rome would create false Spartans, agents dressed in their image, speaking their philosophy, spreading controlled chaos. In other words, Rome would imitate the enemy it feared. At first, it seemed to work. Reports came in from provincial cities, Spartan cells captured, public executions followed. Suspicion temporarily stabilized fear into direction. But there was a problem. The real Spartans did not react. Damaros did not issue denials, he did not adjust strategy, he did not even comment. He simply observed Rome as it began to impersonate its own enemy. And in doing so, Rome made a mistake that empires always make when panicking. It multiplied what it did not understand. Soon, no one could tell real Spartans from false ones. Whispers spread that entire Roman units had been converted, then that governors were secretly aligned with Capua, then that even Senate members were compromised. Paranoia stopped being a symptom. It became governance. One night, a Roman legion stationed near the capital refused entry to its own reinforcements, believing them to be disguised Spartans. A battle broke out between two Roman units under the same flag. By morning, both sides had been decimated. Rome did not know how to report the event, so it didn't. Instead, it blamed enemy deception. But the soldiers began asking a new question. If we cannot recognize ourselves, how do we know who the enemy is? In Capua, Damaros received word of the incident. For the first time, one of his commanders asked him directly, "Is this still war, or has Rome begun destroying itself without us?" Damaros paused before answering. "It is still war," he said, "but not the kind they understand anymore." He stood and walked toward a map of the empire, tracing the invisible fractures now running through it like cracks in glass. "Rome believes we are invading it," he continued, "but we are not." He turned. "We are revealing it." The Senate, meanwhile, escalated again. They ordered mass loyalty trials. Citizens were forced to swear public oaths rejecting Spartan ideology. Entire districts were sealed and interrogated. But ideology is not something that can be contained by walls. The more Rome tried to define Spartan identity, the more it spread as an abstract fear. Even people who had never heard of Capua began to fear being called Spartan-aligned. Then came the incident that broke the illusion of control. A high-ranking senator, one of the architects of Operation Vermilion Mirror, was found in his private chambers, surrounded by shredded documents and broken seals. On the wall behind him, carved deeply into stone, were words in Greek: "You built us." The Senate denied it publicly, but privately, something worse happened. They began to believe it might be true. Not that Spartans had physically infiltrated everything, but that Rome itself had created the conditions for its own enemy to exist. Every act of corruption, every ignored province, every betrayed soldier, every forgotten promise, all of it had weight, and that weight had finally taken form. Back in Capua, Damaros convened his inner circle. For the first time there was hesitation among them, not fear of defeat, but uncertainty about purpose. One warrior asked, "If Rome collapses from within, what remains for us to conquer?" Damaros looked at him calmly. "We are not here to conquer Rome," he said. "We are here to ensure it cannot return as it was." A silence followed. Then he added, "An empire does not die when it is destroyed. It dies when it is no longer believed in." And far away, in Rome itself, belief was beginning to fracture beyond repair. Rome had stopped pretending this was a normal war. There were no declarations anymore, no formal strategies announced to the public. The Senate simply issued directives, cold, fragmented commands that spread through the empire like nervous impulses through a failing body. Neutralize dissent, purify command structures, identify Spartan influence vectors. Even language itself was breaking down into paranoia. And yet, the Spartans were not advancing. They had not pushed deeper into Italy in months. Capua remained their center, not a growing empire, but a fixed point, like an anchor dropped into a restless sea. This unsettled Rome more than invasion ever had, because Rome understood expansion. It did not understand stillness with intent. So the Senate escalated again. This time they abandoned subtlety entirely. They authorized the burning edict. Any city suspected of Spartan sympathy could be isolated, trade cut off, leadership removed. In extreme cases, the city would be burned to prevent ideological spread. It was not framed as cruelty, it was framed as hygiene. The first city to fall under the edict was Antium. It took 3 days. When the smoke rose, it was not just buildings that disappeared, but trust. Neighbor turned against neighbor. Soldiers refused orders they could not verify. Governors began hiding correspondence. Rome was no longer governing, it was reacting. And reaction is always slower than change. Meanwhile, something unexpected began happening in the Spartan-controlled regions. People started leaving voluntarily, not fleeing violence, but arriving at Capua seeking structure, order, certainty. Rome had become unpredictable. The Spartans had become consistent. Damaros did not celebrate this. He did not even welcome it openly. Instead, he tightened discipline. No excess, no indulgence, no ideology beyond one principle. Strength must be honest. But even among Spartans, questions began to form. Because Rome's collapse was no longer a single enemy's doing, it was systemic. And systems, once broken, do not always produce victory for anyone. One night, a messenger arrived from deep within Roman territory. Not a spy, not a soldier, a senator. He had crossed borders alone, without escort, carrying only a sealed scroll. When brought before Damaros, he did not kneel. He simply said, "Rome cannot find its center anymore." Damaros studied him. "And you came here to ask for what?" he replied. The senator hesitated. "Direction," he said finally, "or confirmation that we are already lost." Silence filled the hall. For the first time, even Spartan warriors shifted uneasily, not from fear of Rome, but from recognition of something larger. Damaros broke the silence. "You think we are your enemy," he said, "but we are only the reflection of what you allowed yourselves to become." The senator laughed bitterly. "Then destroy us quickly," he said. "Because Rome is suffering through too many reflections at once." After he left, Damaros stood alone for a long time. The war had changed shape. It was no longer Spartans versus Rome. It was order versus fragmentation, and both were bleeding into each other. Then came the catastrophe. A coordinated Roman operation struck simultaneously across multiple regions, not legions in open battle, but hidden cells activating at once, assassinations, sabotage, false Spartan uprisings staged to justify purges. For a brief moment it looked like Rome had regained control. Cities fell back into obedience through fear, executions restored temporary order, but something went wrong in the design. The fake Spartan cells began behaving like real ones, and the real Spartans responded to them as if they were real threats. Soon no one could tell which side had created which. Entire provinces erupted into layered conflict. Romans fighting Romans pretending to be Spartans. Spartans eliminating imposters. Civilians caught in overlapping accusations. It was no longer war. It was systemic confusion given weapons. In Capua, Damaros received reports faster than they could be understood. One of his commanders finally said, "This is no longer controllable. Even we cannot trace what is ours anymore." Damaros did not answer immediately. Then he said, "Control was never the point." He turned to the map again. Rome was not collapsing in a straight line. It was dissolving into itself. And for the first time, Damaros acknowledged something quietly, almost privately. If Rome disappeared like this, there might be nothing left to replace it with. Only absence. And absence does not build empires. It only leaves space where they used to be. By the time Rome understood what had happened, it was already too late to stop it. There was no final battle, no decisive siege, no moment of collapse that historians could later point to and say, "Here, this is where the empire fell." Instead, there was simply absence. Legions stopped reporting in, governors stopped sending orders, trade routes went quiet. Even the Senate, once loud with argument and ambition, began meeting with empty seats that no one could explain anymore. Rome had not been conquered, it had been unstitched. Damaros stood outside Capua as the first reports of complete provincial silence arrived. Not rebellion, not surrender, silence. Cities that once fed the empire now responded to nothing at all, as if Rome had never existed in their minds. One of his commanders finally spoke what everyone feared. We won. But there was no triumph in his voice. Damaros did not answer immediately. He watched the horizon, where roads once carried legions, merchants, and messages that defined the world. Now they carried nothing. I do not think we won, he said quietly. I think Rome stopped recognizing itself. And that was the truth no one had prepared for. Rome's greatest strength had never been its armies, it had been its ability to define reality for itself and make others accept it. But once that definition fractured, once every city, soldier and senator began interpreting Rome differently, it ceased to exist as a single thing. It became many broken versions of itself, and then even those versions stopped agreeing. In the ruins of the capital, a final Senate session was attempted. Only 7 senators arrived. No guards, no slaves, no messengers, just marble echoing emptiness. They argued briefly, old habits dying hard. Then one of them said, "Who are we speaking for?" No one answered, because there was no longer a Rome large enough to receive the answer. Far away, in Capua, Damaros made a decision. He ordered the Spartans to stop advancing entirely. This surprised even his most loyal warriors. "We could take what remains," one said. "We could rebuild the world in our image." Damaros shook his head. "That is how Rome began," he replied. Silence followed. He continued. "Empires do not fail because they are weak. They fail because they believe they must expand forever, and in doing so, they forget what they are at home." He looked at his soldiers, men shaped by discipline, violence, survival. "You are not here to replace Rome," he said. "You are here because Rome proved what happens when power forgets restraint." Days passed, then weeks, and something unexpected happened. Without Rome pushing against it, without resistance to define it, the Spartan order itself began to change. Some warriors left, not in betrayal, but in search of lives that were no longer defined by war. Others stayed, uncertain what they were guarding anymore. Capua remained structured, disciplined, but quieter than before. The world had lost its center, and without a center, even strength loses direction. One evening, Damaros walked alone beyond the city walls. A young soldier followed him at a distance. "Are we still Spartans?" the soldier asked. Damaros did not turn. "Yes," he said. A pause. "But Sparta was never a place," he added. "It was a decision, and decisions can be forgotten if they are not questioned." The soldier looked confused. "Then what is Rome now?" he asked. Damaros finally stopped walking. He looked at the empty road stretching toward the horizon. "Rome," he said slowly, "is what happens when an idea grows faster than the people who carry it." He turned back toward Capua, and it ended the moment no one could agree what it meant anymore. Behind them, the wind moved through broken fields where legions once marched. There were no victories left to claim, no enemies left to fight, only the long, quiet aftermath of everything that had once been certain. And somewhere in that silence, history stopped recording war and started remembering what remained when war no longer had meaning.